Introduction. Why Iwo Jima is a deadly trap. Imagine a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean, just 21 square kilometers of black volcanic ash surrounded by raging seas. Iwo Jima, 1945. Here, American Marines landed under heavy fire, and surviving even a single day seemed impossible. I always wondered, what is it like to set foot on land where every step could be your last? Let's take a look at what made this battle one of the bloodiest of World War II. It all started with the Japanese defense. At the beginning of the battle, the garrison numbered about 21,000 soldiers. They built a powerful system of fortifications, underground tunnels up to 18 kilometers long, bunkers where they could hide from bombs and artillery. The Japanese sat deep underground, virtually invulnerable, and could fight for months. But here's what's striking. Of those 21,000, only 216 surrendered. The rest died in battle or committed suicide. They preferred death to surrender. That was their code. Now imagine, February 16, 1945. The American fleet approaches the island and begins a 3-day bombardment. Naval artillery pounds Iwo Jima without interruption, while tons of bombs rain down from aircraft carriers and B-29 bombers. It seemed as if the island would be reduced to dust, but the Japanese in their tunnels were almost unscathed. They waited, and then the climax. February 19, 9 a.m. The 4th and 5th U.S. Marine divisions begin their landing. The Japanese don't fire right away. Clever, right? They let the Americans get closer. And then, hell. In the first few minutes, there was silence, but an hour later, a quarter of the American troops were destroyed. Armored personnel carriers got stuck in volcanic ash on the shore, leaving the infantry without support. Fire came from everywhere: machine guns, mortar, snipers from tunnels. The fighting lasted throughout February and March. The Japanese emerged from their shelters for surprise attacks and guerrilla raids. The Americans couldn't even dig in. The ground crumbled. The ash suffocated them. They used flamethrowers and bombs to clear the tunnels, but the losses were enormous, about 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. The Japanese held out to the last, despite the lack of water and food. They wore down the enemy, turning the island into a meat grinder. Finally, on March 26, the Americans completed the mop-up. Iwo Jima fell, but at what cost? Almost the entire Japanese garrison was destroyed. And for the Americans, every day on the island was a test of survival. Powerful defenses, extreme conditions, constant fire. That's why no one could hold out here without a miracle. Preparing the defense, the underground hell of Iwo Jima. Imagine, you are a soldier on Iwo Jima. You are not just fighting the enemy, you are fighting the earth itself. A volcanic island where the air is saturated with poisonous gases and beneath your feet is a burning hell. The Japanese turned this piece of land into an impregnable fortress, and today I will tell you how they did it. How 21,000 people created an underground labyrinth where every minute of work could be their last. Ready? Let's dive in. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming, and they were ready. By the start of the battle in 1945, there were 21,000 soldiers on the island, and each of them understood that surrender was not an option. Only 216 of them were taken prisoner. The rest chose to fight or die. But what made them so invincible? Tunnels, 18 kilometers of underground passages dug into volcanic rock. These fortifications were their shield. For 3 days, starting on February 16, the American fleet bombarded the island with artillery, and bombs rained down from B-29s and aircraft carriers. But the Japanese, they sat in their bunkers, almost invulnerable. Now imagine what it was like to dig these tunnels. The temperature underground was like an oven. The gases were suffocating, and their lungs were burning. The soldiers had only 5 minutes to work in the tunnel. 5 minutes. Then it was time for a change. Otherwise they would die of suffocation. I imagine a young soldier descending into this hell, sweat pouring into his eyes, the pickaxe in his hands trembling, and somewhere above, American planes buzzing. One wrong step and it's all over. But he digs, because he knows these tunnels are their only chance. And so, on February 19, at 9 a.m., American Marines land. The 4th and 5th Divisions climb ashore, and the Japanese remain silent. Not a shot is fired. They wait for the enemy to come closer. And then suddenly, a barrage of fire. In an hour and a quarter of the Americans are destroyed. Armored personnel carriers get stuck in the ash, leaving the infantry without cover. The Japanese emerge from the tunnels like ghosts, strike and disappear. The volcanic soil is their ally. The Americans cannot dig in, the ground crumbles, and the ash clogs their lungs. February and March were a nightmare. The Japanese staged guerrilla raids, firing from their hiding places. The Americans responded with flamethrowers, clearing the tunnels with bombs. But the losses: 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese held out, despite hunger and thirst. They fought to their last breath. It was only on March 26 that the Americans captured the island. But at what cost? Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed. The Americans survived, but every day on Iwo Jima was like running through a minefield. American preparation, fire from the sky and sea. Imagine you were standing on the deck of an American battleship, and before you lies Iwo Jima. The island is shrouded in smoke and flames. Since February 16, 1945, the American fleet has been unleashing all its power on it. Naval artillery fires non-stop, and the sky buzzes with B-29 bombers and aircraft from aircraft carriers. It was like a hellish light show. Thousands of tons of bombs, explosions that shook the earth. I wondered, how could anyone survive such fire? But the Japanese found a way. Let's figure out how. For 3 days, from February 16th to 18th, the Americans turned Iwo Jima into a burning cauldron. Ships fired so intensely that the sea boiled, and aircraft dropped bombs that seemed capable of sinking the island itself. It was the most powerful artillery preparation before a landing in history. But here's what's shocking. The Japanese, 21,000 soldiers, suffered almost no casualties. Why? They were saved by tunnels to 18 kilometers of underground passages dug into volcanic rock. They sat there in their bunkers while the earth shook above. Of those 21,000, only 216 surrendered. The rest prepared to fight to the end. Now imagine yourself as a B-29 pilot. You're flying over Iwo Jima, you see the island burning, and you think, we crushed them. But no, you drop your bombs, and the Japanese underground don't even flinch. It's like hitting a shadow. The enemy is invisible, but he's there, and he's waiting. The Americans believed that artillery preparation would break the enemy, but it only fueled their determination. And then, on February 19th, at 9 a.m., the 4th and 5th U.S. Marine Divisions begin their landing. I imagine a young Marine jumping ashore, full of hope that the bombing has done its job. But the Japanese are silent. Not a shot is fired. They wait for the Americans to get closer. And suddenly, hell, in an hour, a quarter of the troops are destroyed. Armored personnel carriers get stuck in volcanic ash, leaving the infantry without cover. The Japanese strike from tunnels like ghosts and disappear. The fighting throughout February and March was a nightmare. The Japanese made sorties, taking advantage of their cover. The Americans could not dig in. Ash fell, fortifications collapsed. They burned the tunnels with flamethrowers, dropped bombs, but the losses grew. 7,000 dead, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese fought to the last, despite hunger and thirst. On March 26, the Americans captured the island, but at what cost? Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed, and for the Marines, every day was a struggle for survival. D-Day, the treacherous landing, and the first hour of hell. February 19, 1945, 9 a.m. Imagine, you are a Marine, jumping from a landing craft onto the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. Silence, not a single shot. Your heart is pounding, but everything seems to be under control. And then, hell. In 1 hour, a quarter of your comrades are dead. The Japanese, under the command of General Kuribayashi, have lured you into a trap. Today, I'll tell you how the first hour of the landing became a meat grinder from which few emerged alive. After 3 days of artillery bombardment starting on February 16th, naval artillery, bombs from B-29s, aircraft carriers, the Americans thought the Japanese were defeated. The 21,000 soldiers of the Iwo Jima garrison, it seemed they would not hold out. But Kuribayashi was cunning. His 18 kilometers of underground tunnels made the Japanese almost invulnerable. Of the 21,000, only 216 surrendered. The rest chose to fight or die. And they waited for their moment. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed. The first few minutes were eerily quiet. I imagine a young soldier walking through the ashes, thinking, "We did it." But the Japanese did not fire. They waited until the Americans approached their fortifications, and then suddenly, a barrage of fire, machine guns, artillery, mortar. The sand beneath their feet is quicksand, it is impossible to dig in. One chronicler wrote, "The Americans thought the landing was a jump into a safe zone. They quickly realized it was a jump into a meat grinder." And he was right. And what about the equipment? Of the 56 tanks, half were stuck in volcanic ash. They became targets, easy targets for Japanese guns. The infantry was left without cover, under open fire. Imagine, you are running along the beach, explosions all around you, and the tank that is supposed to protect you is sinking in the ash. In an hour, a quarter of the troops were destroyed. It wasn't a battle. It was a nightmare. The Japanese, hidden in tunnels, struck and disappeared. Throughout February and March, they wore down the Americans with guerrilla raids. The Americans burned the tunnels with flamethrowers and dropped bombs. But the losses mounted: 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese fought on, despite hunger and thirst, until March 26, when the island fell. But that first hour, it showed that Iwo Jima was a place where survival was almost impossible. Guerrilla warfare in the underground, death from the shadows. Imagine. Nighttime on Iwo Jima, February 1945. You are a Marine, sneaking through the darkness, your flashlight barely illuminating the damp walls of a Japanese tunnel. All around is silence, but it is deceptive. At any moment, an enemy could jump out of the shadows. 5 weeks of fierce fighting, and every day is a game of death. The Japanese, hidden in their 18-kilometer underground labyrinths, turned the island into a nightmare. Today, I will tell you how they fought from the shadows, and why General Kuribayashi instilled in his men the belief that no one should die until they have killed at least 10 enemies. After landing on February 19th, the Americans thought the worst was behind them. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed, but lost a quarter of their troops in the first hour. The Japanese minus 21,000 soldiers under the command of Kuribayashi did not just fight back. Their tunnels, dug into volcanic rock, made them invisible. Of the 21,000, only 216 surrendered. The rest, fight or suicide. They waited like predators. From February 16, the American fleet pounded the island with artillery for 3 days. Bombs rained down from B-29s, but the Japanese in their shelters hardly noticed. Now imagine, you are a soldier making your way across the island. Volcanic ash crumbles under your feet, making it impossible to dig in. Suddenly, a shot rings out from nowhere. The Japanese emerge from tunnels, strike and disappear. Their guerrilla raids are like a knife in the back. One Marine recalled, "You walk, and the ground beneath you comes alive." That was their plan, to weigh you down, to keep you in fear. Kuribayashi demanded that every soldier take out a dozen enemies, and they followed that commandment. The Americans tried to fight back. Flamethrowers burst into the tunnels, burning everything in their path. Bombs littered the passages, but the Japanese were everywhere. The volcanic soil betrayed them. Fortifications collapsed. Armored personnel carriers sank into the ash while still on the shore. Casualties mounted. 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese fought on, despite hunger and thirst. Imagine, You're in a tunnel, the air is heavy, there's no water, but you're holding a rifle because you know this is your last battle. 5 weeks of hell. From February to March. By March 26, the Americans had captured the island, but at what cost? Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed. Every day was a test for the Marines. Volcanic ash, fire from tunnels, traps. Iwo Jima became a symbol of perseverance and horror. The result? Victory at an impossible price. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima fell. The American flag was raised, but at what cost? Nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders were killed, and the Americans lost 7,000 killed and 20,000 wounded. I stand before this number and think, how was it possible to survive even a single day in this hell? Iwo Jima became more than just a battle, it became a symbol where nature and man merged into one merciless enemy. Today, I will tell you why this victory came at such a high price and what it left us with. The Japanese made Iwo Jima impregnable. -1 kilometers of underground tunnels dug into volcanic rock allowed 21,000 soldiers to withstand the bombing. From February 16, the American fleet bombarded the island for 3 days, with B-29s and aircraft carriers dropping thousands of tons of bombs. But the Japanese, of the 21,000, only 216 surrendered. The rest chose to fight or commit suicide. Their fortifications were like a labyrinth of death, where every corner could be your last. Imagine, you are a Marine who landed on February 19. The silence of the first few minutes is a trap. An hour later, a quarter of your comrades are dead. The Japanese are firing from tunnels, machine guns and artillery, preventing you from raising your head. Armored personnel carriers are sinking into the ash. It is impossible to dig in. The volcanic soil crumbles under your feet. I imagine a soldier looking at this black sand and realizing, there is no shelter here, only battle. For 5 weeks, from February to March, the Americans fought an invisible enemy. The Japanese made sorties, emerging from tunnels like shadows. The Americans burned them with flamethrowers and bombarded them with bombs. But their losses grew. 7,000 were killed and 20,000 wounded. The Japanese fought despite hunger and thirst. They knew their task was to wear down the enemy, and they did so until their last breath, until March 26, when the island fell. But what is victory if it costs the lives of almost everyone? Iwo Jima showed that war is not just about the enemy. It is volcanic ash that suffocates. It is tunnels where death awaits in the darkness. It is a place where surviving a day is already a feat. The Americans won, but they paid a price that cannot be forgotten. Iwo Jima became a symbol of self-sacrifice, where man and nature conspired against life. Epilogue, Legends and Myths of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, March 26, 1945. The island has been captured, but its shadows still whisper stories. They say that the ghosts of Japanese soldiers still roam the tunnels, and the wind carries their last words. I have heard stories from veterans and their descendants, and each time I get goosebumps. This battle is not just a battle, but a legend of human resilience, where survival meant winning the battle within oneself. Let's take a look at why Iwo Jima still lives on in myths. The battle began with 21,000 Japanese soldiers, sheltered in 18 kilometers of underground tunnels. They endured everything. From February 16th, the American fleet bombarded the island with artillery for 3 days, while B-29s and aircraft carriers dropped bombs. But the Japanese, only 216 surrendered. The rest chose death, in battle or voluntarily. Their fortifications were like a fortress of spirits, invulnerable to fire from the sky. The Americans learned this on February 19, when the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed. The silence of the first few minutes turned into a nightmare. Within an hour, a quarter of the troops were destroyed. Imagine a veteran recounting years later. At night, we heard rustling from the tunnels. It was as if the Japanese were still there. These stories became myths. The ashes of Iwo Jima, falling underfoot, made it difficult to dig in. Armored personnel carriers sank into it, leaving the infantry unprotected. The Japanese struck from the shadows, raids, traps. The Americans burned the tunnels with flamethrowers and bombed them. But the losses grew. 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese fought to the last breath, despite hunger and thirst. By March 26, the Americans had taken the island, but at what cost? Almost the entire Japanese garrison was killed. Every day was a test for the Marines. Volcanic ash suffocated them. Tunnels hid death. A descendant of a Japanese soldier told me, "My grandfather believed that his spirit would remain on Iwo Jima." Indeed, the island has become a symbol of unbroken spirit. They say that on quiet nights, you can hear the echoes of those battles, as if the ghosts are still fighting. Iwo Jima is not only about war, but also about inner struggle. Surviving there meant overcoming fear, despair, and nature itself. This battle left not only scars, but also legends that live on in stories, songs, and memories. If these stories touched you, like and write in the comments. Do you believe in the ghosts of Iwo Jima? Subscribe, because next is the finale of our story. The moment that became iconic and the heroes whose names are forever linked to this island. It will be unforgettable.